Thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to have you here with the very first of what should be a really, really awesome summer full of cool content. And I want to introduce you to Cora, someone you are going to know and love over the summer because she's the one who planned out all these workshops. And she is going to tell you a little bit more about how this works and introduce you to our speaker. So I will turn it over to you, Cora.
Hello. Thank you everybody for coming today. I guess just before you start, I'll go over a bit of the format that we're going to have today. You should notice that there's a Q&A feature that you can use throughout the talk. Feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. At the end of the talk, we're going to dedicate some time to go through and answer those questions. You can also put in questions at the end of the talk too, as we're answering them. Right now, we're streaming on Twitch. And we're also moderating the chat there as well. At the end of this talk, a survey will pop up, and we really invite you to fill that out. We'd really appreciate that. So now I'm going to introduce Rafa. Rafa is an Android engineer at Dosh who's from Mexico City. He's going to talk to you about open source and the places it can take you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Cora, and thanks, Tyler, for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Let me go ahead and share my presentation here and see. Are y'all able to see it, Cora? Okay, I can see, yeah, that you can see it. So yeah, let me make sure I have the settings there correctly. Cool. All right. Well, yeah, like Cora mentioned, my name is Rafa Moreno. I'm actually currently reside in Austin, Texas, but I actually moved here into the United States from Mexico City. So I went to school at a school called Texas A&M, which is in College Station, Texas. If you're not familiar, it's in the middle of Austin, Dallas, and Houston. So it's kind of right smack dab in the middle there. And for a little bit of background, from my understanding, most of you are somewhere, anywhere kind of in school, but along your computer programming journeys. I actually started programming when I was 21. I was a business major, didn't really know what I wanted to do with that. Then transferred over to engineering. Didn't really know what I wanted to do with that, but I liked the analytical thinking, the solving puzzles, the collaboration aspect that was required for that. And then at some point I fell into programming, and that was really exciting because it still had all the components that I liked, the analytical thinking, the solving puzzles every day. But it also, I viewed it as a way of very much of a platform to be able to solve problems that were really kind of people and society oriented. So right now where I work at Dosh, it's a fintech company. It focuses on putting a little bit of extra money into your wallet every month. So it's very much people in their finances and computer science and programming. For me, I've always viewed it as a platform for doing something like that. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about you today, as you're starting or wherever it is that you are on your journey within programming, is actually my experience with jumping into something called open source. And if you've actually done any sort of programming already, right, you might have used and actually recognized some of these logos here for tools that you've used as a part of your journey. Right, so we have npm, Docker, Kubernetes, and all of these are actually open source, right? So what that means is that the code is actually made available for you to actually go and inspect and see how things work, and it's put online on places like GitHub or GitLab, and there's something that you're able to actually download and inspect in your favorite IDE, the code, and really see what's happening under the hood, right? So I started actually getting into open source not too long ago, a couple of years back, really as a part of, it was just a general curiosity. I had some questions that I was interested in getting answers to. And there were a lot of things I learned about how you can actually use open source to get started in things that you had been wanting to pursue in a bit, break out of your regular patterns and really actually, catapult wherever it is that you are in your career or your education, and really help get to the next level in your programming skill set, right? So today, what we're kind of generally going to go over is specifically what is open source. I've touched about that a little on that a little bit. How specifically it makes you a better developer, right? How it allows you to better understand the tools. Most of the things in the logos that we looked at were actually tools that you use on a regular database or day-to-day, package managers, things that keep your apps alive, all of that. How it actually helps you develop your network, so a little bit more on the soft skills side, and how you can actually get started, right? So there won't be any live code, and this isn't anything that's how to use Git or anything like that. So it'll be still relatively high level, but it'll help you. Hopefully, you'll be able to walk away from this having an idea of how it is that you would actually like to dive in and start potentially looking at open source projects, and a good way to actually find some if it's something that you're interested in. So to actually jump in to the first thing, just to make sure that we're all on the same baseline, right? Is what is open source? Right? The dictionary definition of open source, like a lot of things, isn't super great or descriptive, but this one isn't actually one of the worst ones that I've seen when I've been trying to Google like a technical concept. But just from Wikipedia, the general definition is that it's software. Open source software is a type of computer software in which source code is released under a license, in which the copyright holder grants users the rights to study, change, and distribute the software to anyone and for any purpose. So you still get a general idea. And I like to explain to people that haven't really heard of open source, so whether it be my non-technical friends or people that are just coming into their programming journeys, as code that's just made available publicly for you as the developer to use and modify how you see fit. And usually this is distributed under some sort of license, which determines how you're actually able to use it and whether you're allowed to make money off of it or not, and kind of a whole bunch of technical things that we won't go into. But essentially, if you're finding code on GitHub, GitLab, that's code that's open source. Right? So it's code that's free to you to explore and use and modify and potentially contribute to. Right? So jumping into the first topic, I guess, that we'll cover is how specifically open source makes you a better developer. Right? And when I was jumping into open source for the first time, this was the first thing that I discovered, that I didn't realize how comfortable I had gotten with following the same patterns, right? If you're a beginner to programming, and if you're using a framework or you've been actually using just whatever means you're using JavaScript from scratch, and you've been doing that for a while, chances are that you've started to develop some patterns and start to make some connections between everything that you've actually been learning, and you've been able to repeat those things in order to get a better grasp on how it is that you learn programming or the specific technology that you've been working on, right? So let me give you a quick example. In Android, we have this general high-level architecture called model view, view model. And essentially what that means is we have a view, which is usually the screen in Android. We have some sort of layer that passes, that's called a view model, that passes data from something called a model into the view. So in these 3 steps, you're retrieving data. In the view model, you're processing it somehow, and then passing it up to the view, which actually displays it on the screen. Right? So you don't necessarily have to understand this or really take this away and be able to do anything with it. But to paint a picture, usually in Android, once you've actually jumped into an app, you tend to say, okay, I'm going to write this feature. And what's step 1? I have my view. What's step 2? I create my view model. What's step 3? I need to get data from somewhere, so I create a model or use one that already exists if it makes sense. And there are implementation details within those, but at the end of the day, the process that you followed to establish this pattern, it was already set out, right? And if you're working on if you've been working on an app for a long time, chances are that you've already established some sort of way of organizing that information, right? So every single time you develop a new feature, you'll go through some process that goes like that. As a more code-specific example, we in Android have something called a recycler view. And again, you don't need to know Android or take anything away from this. Kind of the high level is that a recycler view is essentially a list, and that list displays information, right? So most of the apps that you use nowadays, they display these informations in lists. So recycler views are something that we actually on Android, we use a lot. And the way that we actually do that is, again, you don't need to know specifically, you don't need to visualize the code or see or understand what any of this would actually do. But every single time we create a list, we go through the same few steps. We set up an adapter. We override a function called onCreateViewHolder, override another one called onBindViewHolder, and override another one called getItemCount. So we do that every single time we want to start or create a list and actually pass data into it. So independently of what each one of these functions does, every single time we see we have to make a list, immediately our mind jumps to, okay, these are the functions that we need to override. And at some point, you might actually forget or really never have understood what it is that these methods are actually doing. Right? Because you're so used to, your brain goes into this autonomous mode that you're so used to having seen this now that you just immediately start writing out the code, and it's something that the SDK gives you. So by going into open source, one of the things that I really kind of started to appreciate and learn was that uniformity of this code and architecture isn't making you a better developer. Once you grasp the concept and you're able to implement it and actually really run with it, that's great. But the next best thing that you can do after that is kind of reach another level of being uncomfortable and learning something new. And writing the same code day in and day out is great, and you'll keep getting better, and that code will look better. But breaking out of your regular patterns really helps you reach another level of, makes you a little bit uncomfortable, makes your brain have to relearn new patterns and connect different pieces. So one of the things that open source actually provides is that there's a ton of people that are actually contributing to these code bases, right? So whenever something is put onto GitHub or GitLab or is made open source, a ton of people can actually come in and modify the code, right, with certain restrictions. So all of these different people putting in new ways of doing things, and maybe if you've been working on JavaScript for quite some time and you've been working on an app and you dive into NPM, you might notice that they're setting the code up different, that the configurations are a little different, and it might seem a little weird and hard to follow at first. But once you go through it and you understand it, you might actually find that it's something that you're actually able to use, and you might like it better than what you've actually already been doing. And so this is great because as you actually start to move forward in that journey, you're actually also, I mentioned JavaScript, right? In Android, we use Kotlin. Depending on the stack or the frameworks that you're using, you might use different languages, but you start to not see just new patterns in terms of architecture and in terms of the way that the code is written, but sometimes you might see, or you might learn, you might see something that's new to you, right? If in the JavaScript context, if you see somebody use a Lambda or a different syntax, right, than you're used to, and you've been writing things out the long form way, and you see something that's kind of new and shiny, and it might be a little bit confusing, but it catches your eye, and it's something that you need to take a stop and take a second to look at. You might have never known that was a feature in JavaScript or the programming language that you're using. The same thing will happen to me in Kotlin. If I jump onto an open source project that isn't an Android app, or even if it is an Android app, other developers have different and preferred ways of doing things within the same programming language. So along the lines of being able to break out of your regular patterns, introducing some of these new things in the programming languages that you're using is actually really helpful for you to get a grasp on the programming language, and really be able to build up on top of your base level knowledge that you already have, right? And another thing that it actually allows you to do is it lets you take more control of all the things that you're working on, right? If you're in school right now, you get assignments and you have to work on those. You don't get much of a choice. Sometimes whenever you go into industry, this applies as well. Whenever you actually join a company, in my case, I'm an Android developer. If I one day was interested or curious and I want to work on developer tooling, or I want to work on some of the backend components, I want to understand how money is handled with transactions, that's not really something that I have full autonomy over. I was hired to work on the Android app, and there's a lot of freedom and flexibility within there, but what I'm going to be doing at work isn't going to be necessarily breaking out of that. And if you're in school and you're getting assignments, that's also something that you have a little less control over. So by going into open source, you can actually pick and choose, like, what are the things that are interesting. And if it's not something that if you start looking into some code and it's not something that you're actually interested in, you really have nothing to do there, right? You can move on to the next project. If it really wasn't something that you ended up thinking was that neat, you can move on to the next project and start exploring and looking into all the kind of new cool stuff that you get to do there. And there's a lot of people that you work with and that you meet right within these projects that actually ended up being pretty interesting as well. With all these open source projects, you are actually able to work with they have what's called a list of core maintainers. So it'll be people from different companies, right? So it might be, if you've heard of a company called Square, right? They have a lot of open source projects. They also might work on some projects with people that are that work at like Airbnb or Uber or a whole bunch of different places, or just individual freelance developers. And you're actually able to work with a ton of those different people and really understand how it is that different people think through things, process information, the kind of trade-offs that they make for performance versus space, which is the typical kind of situation that you hear. So it's not something that that you get that much of a change with in industry. In school, if that's where you're in, or if you're in a boot camp, you might be able to work with different people on different projects onto as you switch, within the a couple of weeks or however long it is that you're getting those. But once you dive into industry, you tend to be working with the same people day in and day out. And these people come in with different ideas, and that's great. But if you're working with these people for the course of 1 to 2 years, you tend to also get stuck in the same developmental patterns. And the reason why a lot of that is important is because, or at least important with how you collaborate with different people, is because you'll start getting into something called code review, right? So for those of you that have never gone through a process like this, if you've had an internship, maybe the company that you were at did have something where you submit a PR. And for those of you that don't know, a PR is essentially a pull request. You're basically putting your code up for the people on your team to see and critique constructively and give you feedback on before it actually goes into the code base. And the people reviewing your code care about different things, right? So the people in your class will care about different things than the people in the boot camp, than in the people in industry, in your company, and different companies. So it's something that that really kind of can bring out some great things in terms of learning, and lots of different diversity of ideas on how to do things different ways can actually do a lot of good for your development. So with working with these new people, right, a lot of the things that they'll point out, like I mentioned, will be different from company to company, from school to school, from different contexts, different situations. So one of the things that might matter, right, for a group of people is the code style. It's not something that it's one of the things that was surprising to me when I started jumping into the open source contributions, because the code style was essentially made everything uniformly red. It was the whole idea is that you aren't able to tell who on your team wrote a specific piece of code. They don't really leave their footprint on it because everything needs to read uniformly. If somebody were to jump on the code base, it's just easier to keep track of starting from super simple things like did the parentheses go on the same line as the function, or did they go under, things like that. So that gets called out in a lot of PRs, whereas before, for me, it's not something that the people that I was working with cared much about. The different commit messages. If you've never contributed or used GitHub, if you've never contributed to any projects on there, every single time you make a change and you want to stamp that change or save it, for lack of a better word, you give it a message. And that's essentially your save state, if you want to think about it that way. But for a lot of us, especially when we're working on projects just by ourselves, the commit messages that we write it might not be super descriptive, or it might not be the best way to say what was actually going on in those changes, because most of the time, a lot of the time we'll remember, right? Or if you'll find that if you're working on something super long term, you might not. But the commit messages for a different project and a different group of people that I was working with were actually really important, where it was something that I never cared about before. So that was something that I was able to pick up and learn from. Then the PR, the size of the PR, so the size of the changes that you're making. A lot of the times, some people really encourage, like, hey, every single time you change a file, even if the feature isn't completed, submit a PR and we review it so that the PR doesn't get too big. Other people, they say, just finish the feature. It doesn't matter if the PR is excessively big or how that's going to look like. We only want to review one big PR at a time. And there's different philosophies on why people like that, but that's something that I had never considered, that I had needed to started to consider when I was kind of started going into these different projects. And the biggest thing that I never got in school that was always told to me was important, but I really never felt why, was tests. Like I mentioned, when you have one of these open source projects, there's so many people contributing to it. And whenever somebody actually pulls the code down and starts looking at it, there are tests there that run that actually make sure that if I changed code in one place, in one of these massive code bases, that it didn't break functionality in another place. Even when I was working I've worked at companies, that have been startups, where you had to move at a specific pace and tests really weren't that important. I was in intern at Slack, where every single feature, the feature wasn't finished until there were tests. So that was something that was very important, but it's something that I didn't really grasp until it started actually being that I would put a PR up for somebody to review, and it wouldn't never get merged unless it actually had tests that would validate the code that you wrote, for when somebody else would come on and they would be able to confidently change code with being able to know that they didn't break anything in any other place. Because there are so many people contributing to all of these projects, that's something that's actually super important, and you really get to see and leverage the advantage of writing tests. So these are just some examples of some of the things, of some of the technical things that I was able to pick up. But the whole point of these is that they're not just for me, although I do apply them to my day-to-day, in my personal projects and things that I do. But they're things that you can actually take back to your team, and potentially you can educate either it be your colleagues, or if you're have your internships or contributing to other open source projects. There are things that you can actually potentially pitch to the team, and if it was something that was considered before, but the context was different, you needed to move at a certain pace to meet a deadline, or you just didn't have enough people to be able to do it. There are things that by bringing up and asking these questions, you're able to potentially realize, oh, this is something that we can do, right? We can actually spend X amount of time writing tests. We can actually commit to having a linter, which is a tool that makes sure that all your code style is the same whenever you're writing it. And you can actually make your team a little better, right? By establishing like a little bit more process that's not as tedious, that makes sense for your team. And you make your day-to-day go a little bit more smoothly. You stop running into problems that you had before where you not being able to find a commit or understand what it did, or changing pieces of your code base and breaking other parts that you only find in production because you had no tests. So there are things that you're actually able to ideally, hopefully, help bring other people along as well. So the next biggest thing that I got from, well, really this debatably the biggest thing I got from it was how going into actually looking into the open source code makes you understand your tools a little better. And I'll start this off with a story. I was interviewing for a company here in Austin, and one of the questions, it wasn't a whiteboard interview, but one of the questions was how a certain open source library that was really big in Android at the time actually performed its core piece of functionality. And this wasn't actually something that I had ever considered. I was really always into, every single time I would see that an open source library was like the new hotness in Android, really in anything that I would use, I would just put it into whatever play app or project app I would do, and it would just work. So it's not something I had really ever looked at. So this was essentially my answer. It was I had no idea. It just worked, right? And I didn't get that job, and I'm guessing a lot of it had to do with this answer. But one of the things, and actually the reason that I started looking into open source was motivated a lot by this, was that I was actually using a lot of the technologies that I used on a day-to-day. This was definitely true as a student, really without understanding what was going on. And it was super helpful. Depending on the tools and depending on the language, it's really easy to go in and inspect the code and actually see what it's doing just locally on in your IDEs. And but also depending on the tools and depending on the language, it's not actually that easy. So the fact that it was open source allowed me to go in and actually clone the code base, take some time to go through it, really understand what it was that was happening. And it was something that allowed me to continue doing that anytime I was interested in understanding like how it is that something works, or how it is that specific things are implemented. Things that are usually just plug and play and they just happen. All of it was written by people, right? So it's not actually just magic, like I thought. So it was actually things that I was able to take away from and actually learn and use as pieces that potentially I was able to put in different projects. Right? But understanding how all of this worked actually allowed me to write code that went beyond what was actually given to you outside, just from the box, right, of the SDK or any of the docs. So as with a more specific example, if you're using something, if you've heard of a framework called React, it's something it's a framework that's written on top of JavaScript. So you're writing JavaScript code, but a lot of things are just a lot easier. And you're having a problem writing a specific function or implementing something inside of that's actually should be given to you for free by React. One of the big pieces, one of the big things that helps actually level you up as a developer is understanding why it is that works, and so that when it breaks, you can actually understand why it is that it broke, And for most of the things, for a lot of things that happen, and if you're writing code that's particularly hard or complicated, a lot of the stuff that breaks isn't something that you're going to be able to always go into the docs and see, okay, there's a specific line to troubleshoot this problem, and I fixed it. A lot of the times, if you're writing custom implementations for anything, they're not things that there's an answer to on the internet for this is what's going to solve your problem. You need to understand how the underlying code works, and then the questions that you can ask will get a little better. And then by solving the issues that you're looking for in the code, they actually allow you to solve your problem, right? But rarely are you ever actually going to find, how do I implement feature X, right, in this. And when I develop an SDK, and for those of you that don't know, like an SDK is a software development kit. So something where people wrote the code and they are allowing you, make it so that you can actually build on top of that. So React would be like an SDK. In my case, Android, the people at Google wrote, the Android SDK. And whenever we build apps, we tie into that, and then we build stuff out. The people that write the SDK, they're very descriptive usually in how it is that you can perform certain functions. Like I mentioned earlier, the recycler view. React, it'll be like how to show specific things on a screen. But whenever you can do something that the developers of the SDK didn't actually have in mind whenever you had originally, whenever they originally like developed it and started creating it, if you can do something unique and innovative, that's actually super awesome. And that's an SDK developer's dream, right? Is for somebody to take a problem that they have, use your SDK and provide it in such a creative way that they solved a problem that you really didn't think of, right? So a lot of the times what you can do with this too is you not only know, and I mentioned this a little earlier, but you not only know how it is that works, but you can actually, or how it works in the context of the tools that you're using, but you can actually start to then take some of the creative and innovative solutions that the SDK solves for you, and you can apply it to some of the stuff that you're using, or some of the projects that you're developing on your own, right? Or potentially, again, think of something that it wasn't really created for, right? So in a lot of the cases, in Android, there are networking libraries, right? In JavaScript, there are networking libraries. In a lot of the cases, you might not actually want to be including so many dependencies into your work, right? So hardly ever now does anybody actually write out on their own with no dependencies, or with something like fetch, or in Android, it's okay HTTP. But hardly does anybody ever actually write out their own networking libraries within their app that are only used internally. But every once in a while, you might find for different things, if maybe it's image loading, maybe it's something or a library that you find that keeps the website tab like always open on the browser or something like that. You can actually identify and learn how to look for the specific components and pieces of how it makes that work. And maybe you don't need the rest of the fluff in the project or the library, and that's something that you can add and modify and have it be just internal for you. So not only do you get the advantage of you don't have an extra dependency in your project, but you really went through and you learned something, and it was something that you wouldn't otherwise have gotten to pick up if it's not something that if it's not an issue that you had run into or looked into how to solve, and how somebody else solved it before you. So, and then to touch on again, all of these are for, they're definitely to level you up as a developer and allow you to get to that next step and that next level, whatever that may be. But code nowadays, it's super collaborative, and we're always working on teams. By actually bringing a little bit of this and by leveling yourself up, hopefully you make your team better, and that you're able to actually improve their day-to-day and help their daily processes kind of smooth out and be a little better. So the soft skill piece of this, right, that I was particularly surprised by is how open source actually allows you to develop your network, which I think is really, it's something that's super underrated, and maybe a topic that isn't usually as developed within, when you're learning to code. Although whether you're a student and you're going to career fairs and you're getting your resume out that way, or you're a boot camper and there's some sort of career services thing there, or you're however it is that you're learning to code, the best ways, right, for you to get your foot in the door with a lot of the top companies, and not necessarily the top companies, but companies that are right for you, that you maybe previously didn't know existed, right, or just networking, right, which I really like to think more of as going in and you're really just you're making friends, I guess, is I think more like how I like to think about it. You're gathering around, a topic that you're both interested in, and you click, and that's something that you're able to run with, right? But to kind of give a high level example, or like a view, I think of why this is so important to focus on, or to really understand that it's there, right, in open source. Here's a couple of projects, right? This is actually the Kotlin programming language. I mentioned that's the one we use for Android. And it's actually developed by a company called JetBrains. And like I mentioned earlier before, there's core maintainers. So in this case, the core maintainers would be the company JetBrains. But there's actually 343 contributors to Kotlin. And that might be something as much as one of the engineers from JetBrains contributes every day, or somebody one time saw a bug, filed an issue, which means they made the core maintainers of the project aware of it, but it might have been something that they fixed themselves just as a user of the programming language, but not somebody that works for JetBrains. So there's a whole kind of wide variety of involvement there, but somebody who either is working on the project every day or somebody who only worked on it once, right? But there's 343 people that write code there that potentially would also see your code. This is NPM. This is the package manager for JavaScript. There's 582 people that have contributed to that project. And this is Kubernetes, which I guess I won't really go into Kubernetes or what it is, but it's a super, super widely used, powerful project that was open sourced by Google. They have 2,335 contributors, right? So why do I bring up, or what is the importance, right, of understanding that, the code that you're writing that is going into these projects, potentially you'd be working with, however many people that work at a wide variety of different companies. One of the ways, or one of the reasons, and the times that it comes up is when you're wanting to make a career switch, right? Whether that switch is, literally go into tech and programming, or if you're already at a company and you're looking for the next thing, or maybe, as an example, in my case, if I were an Android and I wanted to get into developer tools or backend, or if maybe you work at a company where even if it's just, you might not be in as technical of a role, but you still have a programming background and you're trying to make the jump. It's super, super easy to get exposure and to have your code out there. Whenever you have it out there with the on open source projects, right? So there's a visible track record, right, of your skill set. For those of you, I guess, that are completely new to it, essentially the way it works is, I've mentioned PRs. You can at some point, so whenever you clone, say, NPM, and you want to fix a bug that you noticed that was there whenever you were using it, when you actually submit a PR, which is when people review your code and then put it in the project, your name is on that code, right? And you can actually go through line by line and see what the switches were, right? Hiring is usually, so it's a big risk, right? So whenever you interview somebody, you're trying to emulate what it would be to work with that person. And it's a very flawed process. So that could be a talk all on its own. But whenever you actually have somebody that you've never met before, you don't really know how they work, you had a great resume, and that's why you're being interviewed, but really you're there vetting them for, how is what I'm seeing on the resume actually something, I guess, that I can work with. realistically, the 45 minutes that you get as the single interviewer speaking with that person, and then potentially the full day of on-sites, there's only so much that you can take from that, right? So sometimes you get a lot of false negatives, right? Meaning people that were really good, but were either really nervous that day and then didn't perform well in the interview. But because hiring is such a big risk, right? You're gonna be potentially stuck with that person for a long time if you made a mistake and it wasn't a fit. People tend to stray on the side of, well, I think, it might have been nervousness, it might have been, different factors, but I think we're gonna pass on this one because we're really not sure, and there's no way to know for sure, right? When your code is open source and anybody can go through and look at it, it's much easier for somebody to understand the quality and the level of the work that you bring. And it's easier to get a sense of, okay, this is the kind of work that I can expect from this person, even before talking to them, or as a part of that process. But not only that, you as the person who is working with who is being interviewed, you're actually also interviewing the company, right? So if you've been working on an open source project where there have been a lot of engineers from the company that you're interviewing with that they were super great, they were super helpful, and they were awesome to work with, you're trying to figure that out as well. Like, what is it like to work with them? So that's also hard for you to get from just a day of on-sites. So if you've developed that relationship over time on an open source project, that's a huge plus and a huge benefit for you to be able to know that. But then also those engineers are all going to work for different companies, right? So if maybe you're actually not interested in any of the companies that the engineers on the different open source projects work in, the average time that people actually spend at a company in tech, at least an engineer, is about 2.5 years. So those engineers are going to go work at different companies, and they'll also be hiring. A lot of times they're building out teams. If they've worked with you before, it's a lot of times it's super easy to vouch for somebody who you've worked with before, that for the quality of work that they have, and it's a lot easier to make that hire. And so there's a huge benefit there with being able to actually meet all of these people on these different open source projects. So kind of moving on to, like, hopefully I've gotten you excited, right? And you actually want to go through and start contributing to all all the projects you can find, and you're auditing your tools for what are the kind of things we're doing here, and then where can I go find these projects. But maybe it's also something that you kind of wonder, I guess, like what's the catch, I guess, what's missing here. There's a lot of realities to why people don't contribute, right? Even if they're interested in, a few being, time, if you're a student, right? Or, if you have an internship, sometimes you don't want to be coding all day. If you're a student, you've been doing homework, and that involves a lot of programming. If you've in your internship, right, you've been coding, the entire day for the entire week. So it might not be something that you want to go do at home, but it might be something that you're interested in. There's ways that you can contribute there. Other times, if you are a lot of the times, single parents, even if they want to, they come home from work, they have different responsibilities. There's, I think, lots of reasons that actually, inhibit us from being able to go in and do it. But one of the things that I think was important to point out is that you don't necessarily have to spend a lot of time. You don't have to have, right, a million contributions every day, and you don't have to be in charge of multiple features on multiple different projects and understand these different code bases, because it does take a lot of time. But if you want to get your toe wet and you want to gain some confidence, and you still want, I guess, some of the benefits of being able to understand, recognize all these different patterns, really see, how it is that people talk about and debate different code, and not arguments, but give the feedback on the PRs. A lot of things that you can do are actually can be relatively straightforward and not as time consuming, right? So This is actually a PR. So this is what a PR might look like, right? But this is somebody who contributed to. They fixed a typo on the documentation for a project, and that counts, right? That counts as an open source contribution. So officially they're contributors to the product or to the project, and that's great. So something might be something as simple as a typo might be something that you can contribute. And something else might be you might actually add something to the documentation. So this person was doing something on this web framework called Gatsby that seemed to be common enough, like a common enough thing that people would do, but they couldn't understand what it was. They couldn't find it in the documentation, but thought it would be worth adding. So they went through and they added that into the documentation. And even, I guess, small bug fixes, right? So it's hard to measure exactly how small a bug actually is. It can blow up really easily. But that's another path that you can take is actually something really, really simple. That in this case, it was a one-liner. So you can actually, what I'm trying to get to with showing you that is essentially, we've been talking about how, there's these contributions to open source, but it's not so much, I guess, being a contributor. If it's not, you don't have to be like, writing, fixing typos or looking into the documentation or writing code or anything like that. You can actually just, you can, I guess, just participate, right? You can kind of be a little bit of a lurker, right? You can just kind of look at how it is that people are writing the code and establishing the patterns and everything. If you've ever seen a GitHub, this is like one of the histograms of how often somebody commits. Some people, they'll say, well, I'm not interested in, that seems like a lot. This seems like a full-time job, essentially. Like, I can't quit my actual job to go do this for free. Like, well, your little contribution graph doesn't have to look like that. It actually can have nothing at all, and you can still just check out open issues, right? And there's enough that you can see here. Well, people will comment on this, right, and leave constructive feedback. And you can look at this code here and see, is it different than the code I write? Like, what might it be doing, right? Instead of, it can be at the same time that you spend like reading a blog post or anything. You don't have to be familiar with the entire code base to be able to do this, right? So there, you can also open issues, right? Which those are tabs, right, on GitHub. It would look a little different on GitLab, but you can follow certain issues and see, what is the process like for somebody to actually, on like a live project, get their code submitted and merged into the main repo. So there are things that you don't need a lot of ramp up for. I mentioned it's something that you could do in the same time that it would take you to read a blog post, or if you're coming into the office every morning and you take 10-15 minutes to look at some of the open source projects that you use, see what's actually happening. A lot of times people open issues for things that I didn't know were problems that existed, that they mentioned for some of the open source libraries that I use. So those are big points of learning there. There's a lot that you can do just by participating and kind of being silent in just exposing yourself to the things that are going on inside of the projects as well. So as the last piece, if you're curious on actually how to get started, or I guess maybe where you could actually find a path to go down on to look and to start looking into some projects to see how it all works. Chances are probably you've used an open source tool. If you go ahead and Google it, this actually isn't an open source tool. It's a project called Mattermost. It's a chat. I was interested in learning and finding out like how it was that chat apps actually work. Like I mentioned, I had an internship at Slack previously, but I didn't work on the back end, right? I worked on the Android app. So I was interested in understanding like how it is that all the queuing system worked, how messages were delivered, everything like that. All of these projects, the ones that have good contributor communities, they have this contributing tab that's highlighted there with the little red rectangle. And if you go onto the main page on GitHub or GitLab or wherever it might be hosted, and you click on the contributing.md file, hopefully you're greeted with a message like this, which says, Apollo is a community of developers just like you, striving to create the best tools and libraries around GraphQL. We welcome anyone who wants to contribute or provide constructive feedback, no matter the age or level of experience. If you want to help but don't know where to start, let us know and we'll find something for you. For a lot of people, they have the time, they just don't know where to start. And it can also be a little intimidating, right? Kind of being vulnerable and saying like, I don't really know where in this code base I can actually contribute to, and I don't really know how to start. That alone is enough of a blocker for a lot of people that are really into it. Another project, this is Gatsby, that you actually might be, that hopefully, you would start seeing messages like this when you're interested in contributing, is, we want contributing to Gatsby to be fun, enjoyable, and educational for anyone and everyone. All contributions are welcome, including issues, new docs, as well as updates, tweaks, blog posts, workshops, and more. And they even have pair programming sessions, right? So, so all of this to kind of help people get over the obstacle or the hump of, I don't want to kind of be vulnerable and expose myself to potentially being, criticized for not understanding things. So they develop kind of warm, safe communities. Then you can go to the, I mentioned the issues tab earlier, and you can actually look at the labels and hopefully find something called, like help wanted or good first issue for something that's something that you could be able to pick up as somebody who's new to the code base. And then they also, a lot of the projects also have chats that actually allow you to kind of post questions, and people that are new to contributing to understand and get context for the code base. So hopefully that is, a lot of these projects, have this and they're made available to you. But that is really it for the talk. I have that's my Twitter, right? And email if anybody wants to reach out and have any questions or anything. If you're afraid to ask here in the chat and you want to send me a DM, but I guess now I'll open it. I'll open it up to the Q&A, and if you have any questions, I guess now that I didn't answer in the talk, that you would still like to ask, feel free to include them in here. But I guess so I'll read them. I'll start going through them and read them out loud, and then everybody will hopefully get the answer there. There's a couple. Direct to Slack. Cool. So yeah, this one's you worked at Slack and now you're at Dosh. What did you enjoy most about working at Slack, and how did it help you as you transitioned to other jobs? Cool. Yeah. So that's it was, so one of the, Slack was actually it was my second internship coming when I was at school, and actually this was in 2016. So Slack was only 2 years old at the time, and it was interesting because now, because it's a public company, and it was a rocket ship when I was there. But I think one of the bigger things that it allowed me to do was one was very technical. It was just working with quality engineers. The amount of feedback that I would receive on the PRs was amazing. My PRs would have like 100 comments on them, things that I had never thought about. Sorry, it was something that it was a great experience that now I'm able to, and it also helped me understand how to work on a team of, at that point, the Android app had 15 people, right? So Slack moved at a very specific pace, and it was very fast. So that was good. It set the pace for, I'd always wanted to work in startups. So now transitioning over to Dosh, it helps me. It really helps with, the team is much smaller. You also have to move at a very specific pace. So it does help when people are able to come in and bring new processes into a company, onto new teams. So there's a lot of diversity of experience and ideas there, which was great. And I guess Cora and Tyler, feel free to cut me off whenever we're running out of time, or I guess I want to also respect the amount of time there, but I think we're good.
Yeah,
Cool. So what advice would you give to new coders and college students that think they're interested in pursuing coding and computer science / engineering in general, but have only taken a few courses? Any ideas on how to venture out, learn more, and see if it's a good fit? I think, because this is the topic, I think looking at this open source, the open source part is great. I think we're all in a unique time right now where, you never wish for this to happen, right? But the silver lining of the current climate with COVID is that everything is now kind of being passed online. So I know, unfortunately, a lot of people's internships were canceled, and you have to take full control of what it is that you learn over the summer and how you build up on the foundation that you've built with if you're a new coder, right, and you're in college or in your boot camp, or you're learning on your own. So diving into these open source projects, see what you can do actually to find mentors on these projects. I mentioned Gatsby, as I personally don't use Gatsby because I'm not a web developer, but they have an amazing open source community. You saw that they were very open to new programmers, that they would pair program with you. So finding a mentor, I think, is a huge thing that you can do early on in your career, that is willing to kind of act as a soundboard for you to ask technical questions, pair program, things like that. So a lot of, not a lot, but there are projects out there that do help with that. Even if you didn't have an internship this summer, it's not having something on your resume that implies that you spent the entire summer working on something that you were passionate about and interested in. And it's almost even more impressive that you did that on your own versus because your manager at whatever company you were interning at gave that to you. It's definitely not a lost cause, right? If I'm looking at resumes for people and they haven't had a single internship, but every single summer they worked on these cool projects, they can tell me about them, they can talk in detail about what it is that they were doing. That's just as good, potentially, if not better, than an internship. Right? So if you can pair that with finding a mentor to be able to work on all this with, you're just as good as anybody who did their summer internship at Slack or wherever. Except now it's even better, because if you end up not liking the project 2 or 3 weeks in, a lot of people, they end up not liking their internships 2 or 3 weeks in. So you can just switch projects, but just do make sure that you stay consistent with one for the same amount of time that you would have been in an internship. But I think that's one of the best ways, is this open source stuff. But what are your favorite open source? Favorite open source projects? In terms of it's a lot easier to jump onto things that are tools that you use or products that you use. So for me, I really like to follow, in Android, there's a networking library called OKHTTP. Apollo. So we use something called GraphQL. And so instead of REST, which is a networking, how you receive information from a server, we use something called GraphQL. I really like that one because all of their open source, they have all their open source projects, like the iOS, the Android client, their backend, and they're really helpful communities. Those are big for me, because I use those tools, and so I'm a lot more motivated to contribute to them and make them better, and do what I can to help make the community, I guess, thrive there. So I do a small part. I'm not a core maintainer by any means, but I think my favorite projects are really, I think, the ones that I use, that I feel like I can give back to by helping contribute because I use them. That's the easiest way to stay motivated for that, and to really kind of learn the pieces and apply them to the technologies that I'm working on. And what kind of difficulties did you encounter when making the switch over to engineering at 21, and how did you overcome that, particularly in relation to finding internships/job opportunities? Yeah, for me, it was one of the reasons why I think did well in computer science was because I noticed at some point that it was like the rebellious major. You know, GPA didn't matter. Um, you can open up your laptop at any point and you can start learning, right? I would look into, you know, there were people that would go as far. At some point, I learned that, you know, whatever I learned in my intro to computer science class and data structures and algorithms, past that, I could just not go to any of those classes. And then I could just open up my laptop and learn how to make websites, make apps. The rest of, for a typical computer science major, you know, the rest of the curriculum past data structures and algorithms isn't necessarily contributing to how good of a developer you are in terms of having the knowledge to understand, you know, how it is that like a client and a server works. How do I make a website? How do I make an iOS app, an Android app? So when I switched over at 21, I think the biggest piece was understanding that. And knowing that actually I had more success than a lot of people that had been, you know, as freshmen working or being in computer science, because I was able to take, you know, take to heart, you know, the GPA doesn't matter, and the biggest thing that companies will look for are your projects, and actually, you know, take that to heart and really run with it. And, you know, I was going to hackathons. That was something that was super helpful, right? Was being put in an environment where being exposed to people would put up these amazing apps and these really cool technologies, and asking questions, right? On essentially I would ask questions. I was like, for starters, being exposed to knowing that was even possible, right? And then like asking how, right? So switching over, you know, a little later in my college career, I think ended up being, I see it now as an advantage, because I think I had the maturity as a college student, having known what I wanted in a major and in my job and career trajectory, and kind of Googling and researching, like, you know, what is this career like? What does the industry value in somebody who's good at this? And it wasn't grades, and it wasn't how smart I was. It was, you know, can I ask the right questions? Am I passionate about it? And do I show that by working on projects? I think really the biggest challenge for me has been the technical interviews. And you do get a little bit of an imposter syndrome, especially with me, in my case, I guess, having, you know, switched a little later. There's really, you know, I kind of hesitate to say it was late, because you can learn what I learned at 21, and what some people learn at, you know, 18, and what some people learn at, you know, age 12. You can really learn that at, you know, 30, 40. There's really no, I guess, late for it. You know, you can learn it at any age. But yeah, within the context of, you know, I had to pick what I had to major in at 18 and, you know, graduate at 22. Yeah, I guess it was a little late, because I, you know, switched my major and had to almost restart it when I was a junior. So there was a little bit of an imposter syndrome there. That was a big obstacle that I had to overcome. But you know, it was just making the best of it, and I really enjoyed it and enjoyed my time doing that. But there was a Twitch question. What typically would be our first steps if you want to contribute to a library? I've tried good first issues, but it's overwhelming when there's years of code to look through. Yeah, I think reaching out to, I think that's a big point, and I think that's great that was something that was brought up, because that, like I mentioned, I know for me that was the biggest blocker, was that I really just wouldn't know where to start, even when it was, you know, good first issue. But I think that's where you really need to take a step back. And if you've ever had an internship, you've experienced this, I guess, what I'm about to say. And if you haven't, then you would experience this with the open source project. But when you join a code base, even for an experienced developer, there's a good amount of ramp up time that's expected, right? If I were to hire somebody, or if somebody comes onto my team currently, like at Dosh, we don't really expect them to be productive, I guess, for a week, two, and they're looking at the code 8 hours a day. And so when you're looking at these open source projects, I do mention that's why there's some time, a time investment. You can think about it in the same way. You're jumping onto a new code base. It's big. Like this person mentioned, there's potentially years of code to look through. That's going to be true for probably the majority of the code bases you work on for the rest of your life. So I think if you come through it with that attitude and you treat it the same way you would treat it if you're coming into a code base on a team of people, where you can reach out for help and ask questions. If you're not working on a project, hopefully if it's a project that has tagged it good first issue, usually there's a correlation between the quality of the community there and their willingness to help out and be in those chats and answer questions. But definitely come in with that attitude of this is a code base that I'm going to have to ramp up on. Potentially it's going to take a little bit of time, and if I'm doing this part-time, it might take a couple of weeks. It's not rare to see an issue be worked on for that amount of time. So don't feel pressured, and you're doing it for free probably. So don't feel the pressure of like there's a time crunch that you need to get it now. Definitely ask the current developers or the maintainers, where's the best bet to start looking into this? Where would you look at ramp up on the code base? So that I think would be the best bet, is to find the mentors on the project who can know where to guide you, and then understand that there's a ramp up time to get acclimated to a new code base. What are the steps you take in finding open source projects that you're interested in, since there are many? I kind of touched on this a little earlier. Just the tools that I use, or if I'm interested in finding out how something works. Like I mentioned previously, at some point I wanted to figure out how like a chat app worked. At some point in my life, I was really interested in learning. At some point, maybe I wanted to develop like a programming language or something. I was interested in like compilers. So all this stuff being open source, I would sometimes I would I guess Google or search that onto GitHub, right? But essentially that any tools that you use currently, I think is one, and then two is anything that you're interested in learning, or the best ways for to start, I guess, working or picking up again, I guess I mentioned it's a time investment. So knowing that you're staying motivated with that, having those two things as motivators, having it be a tool that you use or something that you've been wanting to learn for some time, are the best ways to stick with it. And when did I start working with open source code? So about 3 years ago now, I believe. That was something that I was using this very, very specific library for Android, and I was talking to the developer on a Slack group that I'm on with him, and he was a super nice guy, and he had a big like educator's mentality, but he's an engineer, so very technical. He really encouraged me to look into it and was open to asking questions and everything. It was a library that's now since been deprecated, called Store by the New York Times for Android. So that's how I got started. Do open source applications move at different paces? How do important requirements make sure they get done in open source? Yeah, so open source applications do move at different paces, because a lot of the times it's something that people are working on for free. So if it's a company that sponsors it, so I mentioned Kotlin is a programming language, right? And it's an open source programming language, which is really neat because you can just go look at how the programming language was implemented because the code is just public. But to maintain the quality of it, that's why you have the PRs. Nobody can just merge in code into master. It's reviewed, and the final stamp of approval gets marked by the core maintainers of the app. So that would be JetBrains in this case, and they have a very high incentive to make sure that everything in there is quality because developers around the world use the programming language, and a lot of these tools and libraries and projects are the same thing. They'll have a group of core maintainers, and because of so many people's reliance on making sure that project stays quality, they make sure that that the code in there is thoroughly reviewed and everything. And a lot of the times too, specifically to answer how do important requirements make sure they get done, sometimes they don't. If it's a library, so like NPM, for example, I don't know if that's maintained by a company. I think NPM itself is a company, so maybe that's a bad example. I can't think of one right now, but there are a few libraries out there that if the people that work on it for free don't work on it, sometimes it's an individual, which is really why you want to vet your open source libraries before you just chunk them into your code base. If it's just an individual, sometimes you're at the mercy of whenever that individual wants to add the code. So this really, I think the big takeaway from here is if you're using those tools, make sure that they're an active open source project. So if you're Googling networking library and it's an open source one, make sure that, there's been a commit within the last like 2-3 months or so, and that the last one wasn't 2-3 years ago, because that means, they're not actively making sure anything gets done on it. So there definitely do the due diligence there to know that. And then specifically, there's 2 more. How do you plan new open source projects? That's a good question. I've never actually planned one myself, but there is a big big know-how, right? Because at some point, as I've alluded to earlier, and as you can imagine, if you decide to open source something, and people use it, you kind of now have a responsibility to make sure that once that piece of software is in people's code bases, that the updates that you're pushing to that are not breaking anything, because that would imply that they're breaking a ton of people's products, developer tools, all of that. So honestly, I don't have a great answer for, I guess, how you plan one, but it's something that does take a considerable amount of, not a considerable amount, but it does take some pretty ethical, I guess, responsibility to making sure that it's something that, if the plan is for this to be, you want millions of people to use it, there's some due diligence by them to make sure that you're good, that you've been maintaining it, and it's like a quality project for sure. But that it's also something that you're going to be willing to maintain and spend time on as well. So it's not uncommon for projects to ask for a request for new core maintainers, and usually that's a group of people or like volunteers. Other times, if it's I mentioned earlier there was one called Kubernetes, right, that Google runs. To Google, it's not an issue to get engineers from Google to go work on that. So it really just depends on the company or the individual who's actually wanting to start up the project. And then the referral code, I guess, for Dosh, just Rafa M2 is so like Rafa, and then it's first name, first letter of the last name, and a 2. But yeah, I think that's it for all the questions that were there. If nobody has any more, or if you don't want to ask here, feel free to ask in the resources, I guess, that I shared for how to reach out to me. But otherwise, that's it for me. Thank you for coming in and listening. It means a lot.
So I want to thank everybody for coming, and I want to thank Rafa for giving this talk. I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure everybody else did. So we're going to have more talks throughout this week and throughout the rest of the program, and I hope to see all of you there. Have a wonderful day.